Hello, good evening, and a very warm welcome to Face the Nation. I'm sitting in actually for my colleague Shami Rasuddin, and the subject today is a matter that has sort of taken over the attention of most people in Sri Lanka. But the subject itself is nothing new. Sri Lankan Airlines in crisis. This time round, it's the Airbus chapter. And we've got here a panel of 4 people who will hopefully throw some light and see which way forward. Indeed, is there a possibility of asset recovery? Let's find out. Starting off with Mr. Airan Wickramaratne, Member of Parliament, former State Minister of Finance. And good evening to you, Mr. Wickramaratne. And next we have Mr. Krishmal Varnasurya, Counsel. And he's no stranger to the program, and he's here. Good evening, Krishmal. Hopefully you'll throw some light into this matter. And of course, Mr. Varnasurya has a track record. He has worked at the National Carrier for some years before taking to the courts. We don't know if it is to seek refuge, but still. And the next person here is Mr. Asoka Obesekera, who is the Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. Good evening, Asoka, and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And finally, but not least of all, we have got the most mature pilot, active pilot, flying the Sri Lankan skies. Captain Gihan Fernando, he's right here. He is the president of the Aircraft Owners and Operators Association in Sri Lanka. Good evening to you, Captain.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. How many years have you been flying?
52 years.
52 years, and you're still flying?
Yeah, I'm still flying.
Are the skies still blue?
They are most of the time.
Are they safe?
Right. Well, we'll obviously the problem is intense. The newspapers are full of it, the television coverage, radio. Everybody's talking about the latest virus to have struck Sri Lankan Airlines. It's called the Airbus chapter. Let's ask Krishmal Varnasurya to start off. We got 2 minutes each. Krishmal? Sorry, I beg your pardon, 3 minutes each.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you, Airan. Thank you, Faraz. And good evening, Airan. Captain Gaff, I can't call him anything else because he was captain when we flew, so it's captain, it remains. And Asoka and Shehan and your viewers, John. Thank you for inviting me again. Yes, as you said at the start, Faraz, Lanka then, that I joined as a teenage out of school, and Sri Lankan now, which I was there during the conversion. I actually remember going on some of those flights to Toulouse to bring back the new Airbuses. So it has a special place in my heart. So perhaps unlike other days that I participate in your program, this issue will be a passionate one to me, because I know that my fellow crew members and I started off trying to become a pilot like him, and it was midway that law came and and the paths changed. But throughout those 10 years that we were flying around with just 4 aircraft, TriStars, that were always breaking down. Hence we got that name usually late, because we had 43-hour, 50-hour delays. But with all of that for us, because of a dedicated staff, we were carrying back packed loads of passengers, and they all got off happy. I remember this one particular example of a passenger. I'll tell the story very quickly. It's a long one. He said, son, he called me just before landing in Colombo after the London flight. He said, son, I got in with a family of 4 and I can't find my daughter or son anywhere. I requested a window seat and I've been crouched on aisle seat for 10 hours. We are vegetarians from birth and I was served beef. And with all of that, he said, I'm getting off happy. I said, why, sir? He said, son, because you guys, we see how hard you work and you make it all worthwhile and you do all that knowing that all of us are complaining with a smile on your faces. And that's a dedicated crew for us that went to Wuhan recently. It is my batchmate Farhan, I say with the utmost respect, that led that crew. So such a dedicated staff, crew. And what do? We always knew that we were making profits. But somewhere down the line, there was this hole in the bucket that became larger and larger as the years went on. Whilst the staff were trying their best to keep the planes full and the passengers happy and our customers happy, there was a big hole that was always throughout continuous government by nepotism, by putting fellows that had absolutely no idea of what running an airline was about, putting chaps on boards as directors who possibly I won't put as my peer in my law chamber to run an airline. Putting people like that on boards. I know my dear friend Iran is also on the side, and he was also minister of the subject at one time. Hopefully he'll explain why. But that is what happened to this airline, and to date it has become a white elephant that the government has to time and again fund in funds to maintain, when we as an island nation, we have a thriving tourism market. We cannot say that our airline can't make money.
Thank you, Krishmal. It's been said, with accumulated losses of 105 billion rupees and a negative net assets of 65 billion rupees, Sri Lankan Airlines bought aircraft worth 290 billion rupees. We'll talk about that soon, but next off is Mr. Ashoka Obesekera, the Executive Director of Transparency International. What's your take, Ashoka?
So I think for us, in a nutshell, looking at this particular deal, it really shows the issue of conflict of interest. It shows the manner in which two individuals who have been very sort of from the same family have looked to enrich themselves from this particular deal. And it also indicates and shines a light on the way in which some of these big corporate titans as well conduct their activities. Furthermore, when we're looking at the issue of accountability, and I think when we've been looking back at the last so many years, one of the big challenges has been, how do we hold individuals accountable? It's quite interesting to see how on the Friday, when the deferred prosecution agreement details and the statement of fact from the Serious Fraud Office in the UK was released, it was literally within 72 hours or 3 or 4 days that we see the former CEO being taken into remand. Now, the question is whether the Serious Fraud Office release of information was really shedding new light on the issue, or whether the fact that that information became public then meant that there was a need to act in Sri Lanka. So I think that's a big concern. And I think furthermore, underlying this entire situation is the fact that we're talking about a corporate titan like Airbus admitting to the fact that they have engaged in corrupt practices to facilitate the procurement of aircraft. And so on one side, I think we sometimes get detracted by the fact that there are individuals who may have enriched themselves, which is a very important thing to drive accountability on. But on the other side, you have the national carrier paying around 17 billion rupees or $116 million in cancellation charges for a deal which has been procured through corrupt means. And so where is the compensation for the harm caused? So I think that's the really, really important step that the state should be looking at, that Sri Lankan Airlines should be looking at, that the people should be calling for as well, to ensure that there is compensation as well for the losses that have been incurred from this particular deal.
Thank you, Asoka Obesekra, the Executive Director of Transparency International. Next we move on to Captain Gihan Fernando, who's the President of the Aircraft Owners and Operators Association of Sri Lanka, and at 71, the most mature pilot still active in the skies of Sri Lanka. Good evening, welcome again. And Captain Fernando, tell us, what's your take as you observe what's going on? You've been a pilot, you've flown the entire Airbus family for Sri Lankan Airlines and its predecessors, Air Lanka. You've also, probably quite unique, you've flown the Boeing family too. So what's your take on what's happening to the national carrier of Sri Lanka?
Yeah, to start at the beginning, actually in 1947, we used war surplus airplanes, the DC-3, the famous Dakota, to fly the national carrier. Then the first, in 1964, they decided to buy this Avro 748. The guy who put through that deal got a house. Then we had the much against the against logic. They wanted to, without getting another Avro for internal routes in Air Ceylon, they decided to go for a Nord 262, which was another French airplane. And one of the directors got a gyrocopter. So this is how things have been operating from right from the start, right from the mid-60s. So then you wonder what was happening. Now, where the pilots are concerned, the pilots always said, look, ours is not to reason why. Ours is only to sit and fly. Because that was the decisions were made by the people who were on the boards. Now, if you look at the root cause, and you start like Toyota does, you go ask why for all these questions. You eventually end up saying that the boards from about mid-1980 were all friends and family. So what could you expect? I mean, they were not looking at the country or, you know, the greater good of aviation. They just worked where the money was, you see. So that was, I think, one of the problems that we faced. And the pilots, of course, knew that the people who were appointed to these boards were not the best, and they couldn't do anything about it. And we thought this time when the administration changed, they had an advertisement which said people of the profession could get into these places, but it never happened. It was still the same old story of people who are friends and family.
Thank you, Captain Fernando. We now move on to former State Minister of Finance, Member of Parliament, Mr. Airan Wickramaratne. Mr. Wickramaratne, good evening again to you. And as you've heard, friends and family, corruption to the benefit of one family, at two members of one family, according to Mr. Obesekra. And Krishmal bemoaned the fact that 4 aircraft doing their best ended up somewhere along the line with a black hole. And he says that there are some people who ran this airline, who are appointed to the board, who wouldn't work as a peon in the chambers of Varnasuriya. What's your take, Minister, former Minister, but once a Minister, I think always a Minister. Minister, what's your take on what's happened to the national airline?
Thank you for inviting me to be here. I agree with lots of the sentiments expressed, but I might say that the airline industry is a very highly competitive industry. It's not an industry in which you can easily succeed. If you look at the industry even now, many airlines make losses. Now, that is just running clean operations. It's a tough one. And then if you have a bad operation, if you have stealing and robbing and corruption, then it's an impossible task. It's ironic that Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa just last week made a statement in Parliament on the economy, and he said that the previous government wanted to actually close down the airline, and then a few days later it turns out that under his watch, right, that massive fraud has occurred, and it happened to be a court in the UK that actually came up with the information. So this is the way they try to generally cover up these misdeeds. I was the minister in charge of the airline in 2019 until the change of government. And I inherited the airline board, which actually I didn't make any changes. But it is usual that when ministers change, that they change the board. And they generally end up putting their friends and relations on the board. And I decided not to do that because I did not see the fundamental issue as the board. I think the issues with the airline were more fundamental than that. I made only one change on the board. There was a lawyer coming from overseas. I actually asked him to resign so that I could put the head of legal of the Ministry of Finance onto the board of Sri Lankan Airlines, because the relationship between the government treasury and the airline was a very important relationship, and that was the reason that I actually put the head of legal onto the board. I also like to say that last year, Krishmal mentioned the word UL and said usually late. I would like to say in 2019, Sri Lankan Airlines in 2 months won the world's most punctual airline awards. And that credit goes purely to the senior management of Sri Lankan Airlines, purely to them. Because when I left things to them, they knew how exactly to make decisions and run the airline. And there are lots of professional people in Sri Lankan Airlines, particularly on the senior management, and they have also won other awards in 2019. I had a very strict policy of no political interference, zero political interference. There were one instance in which a minister was coming late for a flight, and I gave very strict instructions to the CEO of Sri Lankan Airlines that the airline will not be waiting for any minister, not even for Iran Wickramaratne. That's not possible. It's a professionally run airline. That's the way it should be. So I think if we take our hands off it and we leave it to the professionals to actually run this airline, we will do a much better job. It's unfortunate what has happened in the last few weeks, or what has happened in the last few years, but which we discovered in the last few weeks, and I'm sure we can talk about that.
Thank you, Mr. Wickramaratne. You said a number of factual things, but you forgot about what happened under your watch, and that was the almost daylight robbery of what we now call the Airbus chapter. The details came out of what happened then, and perhaps our journalists are ready with those questions. Just to introduce you, on the far left there is Johnny Fernando. Evening, Johnny.
Good evening.
And on the closer to my left here is Shehan Ranatungu, who's having a long day today. Evening, Shehan.
Evening, Faraz.
So it's open to you for questions.
Thank you, Faraz. So, taking a moment, if we first lay down the facts here in relation to this whole aircraft fraud, it's clear and evident that a fraud did take place. There was an investigation conducted in UK, and then the French company who is related to this fraud did confirm that bribery was paid to a Sri Lankan family, or couple if we call it, in order to make sure this deal of 10 aircraft is done and sent off. So the question remains, who should we hold accountable? Because if we lay down the facts in such a way, we know that this deal was first initiated in 2013 during Mahinda Rajapaksa's regime, and then if we take a look at the board of directors during 2013, we have Nishantha Wickramasinghe, who is the brother-in-law of then President. And then we have Kapila Chandrasena, one of the chief suspects who is in relation to this case. And then we have Nihal Jayamanna, Shamindra Rajapaksa, who is also a nephew of the former president. And then we go on with Manilal Fernando, Lakshmi Sangakkara, Sanat Tukpatta, and Susatha Ratnayaka. So it's clear and evident that this board of directors does also raise a question in the minds of the general public when it comes to when this deal was done. Were there people or were there directors to point the finger and say that this deal does have a little loose end or loophole somewhere? And then that is the whole picture of 2013. And then again in 2015, we know during the next regime's rule, an investigation was conducted once again, or if we call it a BOI committee was appointed in order to investigate this purchasing of 10 aircraft. And then during that investigation, during the BOI, from the report that they submitted, they decided to eliminate purchasing of 4 aircraft from the whole 10 aircraft deal. And with that elimination, a cancellation fee of $115 million had to be paid by Sri Lankan Airlines, which is a loss-making company, just because this cancellation was made. Now, this BOI report, which was hurriedly prepared, did cost the government 3 million rupees. This BOI report. And in this BOI report, certain facts were clearly mentioned. It was critical about the decision to refleet, and then the report mentioned that there's a fault with the methodology adopted, and then certain possible reference to corruption was limited to a directive received by the 4-man task force from unspecified sources. But the report also mentioned, though, and I quote, though there is no material for the BOI to point to specific individuals, there is enough evidence to initiate a high-level criminal investigation into the entire refleeting exercise. And the interesting fact here is, even though this BOI report did mention that, then the chairman who was appointed by the Yahapalane government declined to even internally investigate some of the less critical findings in the BOI report. So basically, the whole BOI report was simply added to history. So the question, once again, that I have to put forward on behalf of the general public is, who can we hold accountable? Was it Mahinda Rajapaksa's regime? Was it the regime during 2015? Mr. Eran Wickramaratne, who can we hold accountable?
Yeah, thank you. I think I need to put this in proper perspective. It was in 2015 when the new government came into office that on the 16th of February, the committee was appointed to look at it. They gave an interim report, and subsequently, by March, and subsequently the fuller report was concluded and given. When that report was given, right, you particularly referred to the fact that 3 or 4 million rupees was spent on that report. And I would like to say that that was nothing, because I know at that time when 900,000 rupees was paid to a member of that board for working 14 hours a day for basically 6 weeks, that was just nothing. I mean, in terms of, because that throws a bad aspersion on Mr. Valiamuna, Mr. Palihakkara, Mr. Abewardana, the accountant, and Mr. Bandara, who was a lawyer in that. And that's why I want to clear that, because when professionals come forward to do a job or work, we need to actually speak in their favor, right? And this was not really payment, this was really expenses on them. So based on their report, right, while I won't comment on what Sri Lankan Airlines did internally, certainly the report was handed, the final report, to the IGP Langakone, right, the bribery commission and the government, right, and therefore investigation was constituted by the IGP consisting of the CID. I even have the names of the people who actually were involved in the investigation. I must say this, that this was the most complex financial criminal investigation in the country, because this was a commitment to pay $2.3 billion in capital expenditure on an airline which had a very small balance sheet, right? So this took time. And also, while they were doing this, this covered several jurisdictions, this one. And then they actually, for over 14 mutual legal assistance requests were made on this report. And actually, a lot of progress has been made in the investigation, and the credit goes to the CID and the FCID in what they have actually done. Now, it was because of that level of investigation and preparedness, right, is that when the couple that has now been taken into custody, the former CEO and his wife, Kapila Chandrasena and his wife, right, and when they were overseas, and then when they slipped back into the country, getting closer to an election, which they probably thought was a safer environment to come back into, right, immediately, because this was all in place, a travel ban was basically taken on them. And therefore, it was possible only because of the internal investigation. While we are talking about the Serious Fraud Office and the French and the US State Department and the Department of Justice and all that has happened, certainly in Sri Lanka that investigation has gone forward, I must say. And therefore, the question arises is, right, for those 8 weeks prior to the election, why wasn't an arrest made? And I don't know the answer to that. I would probably say in the prevailing circumstances, an arrest was not made. But the moment the evidence came from the UK and the judgment came, right, immediately the CID acted basically and basically took the people into arrest. So that is just to put a more perspective on actually what has happened so far, right? And I would even mention Mr. I think it's DIG or SP, I just don't know the title of the gentleman, Shani Abesekara. I must say that he played a role actually in that investigation, and all this information was there. The subsequent matter that you raised, right, was about the cancellation which happened during our time and the payments made for the cancellation. There were reasons why it was cancelled. There were reasons, and that was based on consultancy reports and all that. And there is a debate as to whether the amount paid was too much or not, and certainly there is a debate about that. But I would make this final comment on that, and I would say that given that this was a corrupt deal, and now the corruption is proven, I still believe that this $2 million that's being talked about is the tip of the iceberg. The corruption is much, much bigger than that, right? And we can go into that later. I think that given that, I think we need to be looking at even recovering the cancellation fees that we have paid from Airbus.
Mr. Wickramaratne, just one little thing there. It's true that they went to court after the details came out from the judgment in the United Kingdom matter. However, around 3 months before that, the CID had already gone to court and obtained a travel ban on Kapila Chandrasena and his wife, indicating to us that they knew what was happening. And it's a matter of concern, if not conjecture, as to why the CID waited. We are also told that the CID actually helped the British authorities, the SFO, with various matters, and it was that the input from the team led by Shani Abesekara that led in part to getting this conviction or this arrangement, an admission of guilt on the part of Airbus Industries. So I thought I'd just make that point there.
Yeah, I agree with what you have said. The Special Task Force on the Recovery of Stolen Assets, START, played an important role, and particularly getting foreign assistance, because Sri Lanka didn't have the necessary skills also in this investigating this financial crime, and they had been working together. And what you said is accurate. The case hadn't been instituted, but certainly investigations had happened, and it helped. As he said, they went to court first.
May I be permitted to bring in another angle to your question? You asked who's responsible, who do you as the public hold responsible? So I have another angle to it. Lanka, Sri Lankan, has continued to remain part of what we call extended government in law. You see, government means of the people. Our sovereign power is divided into 3 branches: executive, legislative and judicial. Now, it's an executive arm Why our Supreme Court has held so after Emirates went off? Because it's everyday business of running an airline, whilst the government on its own with the minister can't do. We still hold authority over that executive arm of government. That is why in law it's considered executive arm of government. So the executive branch of government, headed by the president and a cabinet of ministers and officials that come under it, remain responsible. Then it's also subject to legislative control, our legislative power. Why? The people elect a legislature, and Lanka or Sri Lanka is subject to review by Committee of Public Enterprise. Therefore, it becomes subject to legislative review. They are also responsible. On that note, may I say that this cabinet memo that is now flying around after this deal came up for us, thank you, when some time back we discussed it, thanks to your station, I have a copy of it, which is dated 8th of February 2017, this cabinet memo, memorandum number MPEDES 1/2/CM, just submitted by the then minister, I think before Iran, on the Sri Lankan Airbus A3500, what you say, on the return payment, the early termination payments, and in this they say, this is to me, as a citizen that spends tax monies in this country, I contribute to tax, and this is criminal. In 2017, we didn't know anything. This says the minister is actually having the audacity to report to a cabinet. We did not know that they had agreed to terminate these 3 aircraft. Cabinet memo which included decision of a CCM minute such and such have been received, but these documents are not there. An observation made by HE the President, I will submit later. It is still under discussion and they're still looking for documents. So if this is the responsibility that we have vested in our government, which is executive and legislative, meaning both sides, all sides of the scale, we as citizens need to question what was our government doing. I'm not talking of only one government, continuous governments. This is why, I go back to an earlier question that you raised. Iran said no, with minimum governmental influence. The long time ago, Iran, I think, as I was about to leave, the then president appointed Mr. Harry Jayawardene as chairman for a few months. And his only condition, if I remember correctly, was to Madam President then, I will only answer to you. Don't ask me to answer to this, that and the other minister. And as he came, he sent bills for all the ministers who have been enjoying free travel. It was only during his chairmanship that I as an employee got 2 bonuses that year. We actually showed profit. Not only in December, we got April and December 2 bonuses. And he showed profit. So if one man can do it, that means if the airline is managed properly, it needs a bit of control. I dispute the point that we can just let it be run by anyone. It needs a bit of control. But this sort of cabinet memos, I think, is an eyewash. Because if you go, I don't have time to go into the whole detail. It's a long memo. Down at the bottom, when you go on, you see, we don't really know who has authorized this repayment. So one government, now I'm talking government, not a party. Governments are formed by elected political parties. No, one government decides in the business interest to buy 10 aircraft. Another government decides it's not in the business interest and therefore we're going to return them. Who ultimately pays for all this? You and I do. And we, the people, must hold them responsible.
Thank you. Sorry, Shan. Asuka Obesekri, can I just quote a few lines from what Minister Kabir Hashim says in the same memo that Krishmal Varnasuri has just referred to. It says here that, however, on or about the 19th of October 2016, the Ministry of Public Enterprise Development was made aware that Sri Lankan Airlines had, in fact, entered into an agreement with AirCap for the early termination of 3 aircraft, as neither the ministry had been officially intimated or approval sought or cabinet approval obtained, as none of the cabinet decisions received thus far had indicated the same. The secretary to the ministry, by his letter dated the 20th of October, requested confirmation from Sri Lankan Airlines. After several verbal inquiries, the secretary sent a reminder on the 27th of December, for which then a response from Sri Lankan Airlines was received on the 28th of December. It is pertinent to state that the papers submitted by Sri Lankan Airlines to CCEM, the cabinet within the cabinet, on the 26th of October 2016, had been some 21 days after the early termination agreement had been signed on the 4th of October 2016. Could you comment on this? The Sri Lankan Airlines entered into an agreement and then tell the cabinet, the special committee within the cabinet, the CCEM.
Yeah, so I mean, judging by what you're saying there, the fact that this has gone to CCEM after the decision has been taken is something of concern. And I think looking right through this entire transaction, there are we continuously hear of the issues around the timing. I mean, here I have the conclusions of the Auditor General's report in November 2018. And he says, it is hereby concluded that the decision which had been taken by the management of the company to add 14 modern aircrafts to the fleet within 8 years without obtaining approval of the Cabinet of Ministers and without making a proper cost-benefit analysis is a decision taken beyond the powers of the management, and therefore the officers are responsible for the failure resulting in that decision. So, I mean, right through this entire deal, I mean, even looking to 2013 when these orders were placed, the fact that the Auditor General himself says that the procurement process, and he details it in some detail, it goes through it in some detail, I mean, there is a significant issue there. Maybe one point which I would flag up, and this is just a point which is sort of coming to my mind, but it's interesting because in 2018, there was also the passage of the National Audit Act, and under Section 19 of the National Audit Act, the ability for those who have, through corruption or through negligence, caused loss to the state, the idea that they are held personally responsible is something, when it comes to accountability, that's one thing worth flagging up. Now, obviously, when we're looking at the quantum of the losses here, very few individuals in Sri Lanka will ever be able to bear those sorts of losses personally. However, I mean, when it comes to the accountability of individuals, that sort of accountability is also there under the National Audit Act. But I think importantly, it's essential, and I think I'll just flag up two things. One thing is that I haven't seen the nature of these lease agreements in which these aircraft have been taken. However, as France is an OECD country, there are also these OECD guidelines on how multinational companies listed in those entities have to conduct themselves. And there are grievance redress mechanisms as well, which require the engagement of the national contact point in their respective countries. So in this case, it would be France, because EADS is a listed entity in France. So it's essential that those sorts of avenues are also exhausted to see how we can get some redress and compensation for, on this particular deal.
Asuka, it might be worth mentioning how this whole affair started in the United Kingdom. It started because Airbus asked the UK export the UK Export Financing Department for assistance to finance these transactions. And when it came to the Sri Lankan transaction, the UK Export Financing Unit asked a routine question about agencies and so on.
Yeah.
And when that information was given to them, they pointed out and they wanted to know why it is that they had engaged somebody who was not in this territory, in Sri Lanka, because the company was registered in Brunei. And they then also asked for the CV of this person, because this company consisted of one person doing two jobs. One acting as a director of the company and the other the sole shareholder. So they wanted to know why it is that the person was out of the territory, and also why it is that a person without any experience in airline sales had been engaged as an agent or a consultant or whatever. And when Airbus, when the going got tough, Airbus withdrew their application, and obviously the UK Export Financing Department were not entirely happy with the pulling out of that. They reported the entire matter to the Serious Fraud Office.
Yeah, and importantly, they also identified the relationship between the executive in the company and the and Airbus. Airbus have admitted to the fact that they lied on that particular issue and said that these two individuals are not related parties. So I mean, you know, it shines a light on the practices of entities like Airbus as well.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it's now time for a break. So we'll come back, and when we come back, we'll have questions from Shayan Ranathan too.
අලුත්ම සින්දු උණුනුවම
Edi barusa ඇත හැලුනත් නොයන ක්‍රීමෙට වගේ
අලුත්ම TikToks උණුනුවම
थोड़ा रेशम लगता है थोड़ा शीशा लगता है
අලුත්ම games and challenges උණුනුවම මේ ඔක්කොම බලන්න සතිය දවස් 5ම දඟරැල්ල බලන්න දඟරැල්ල සතියේ දින 5ම උදෑසන 10ට
Sunrise Melodies සතියේ සෑම දිනකම උදෑසන 5ට.
Good evening. Welcome to Brainbusters with Slip Season 2.
27 schools across the island. 27 selected students testing their brains to win the ultimate championship. The Brainbusters with Slit Season 2.
Brainbusters with Slit. Saturday at 6:30 p.m.
Just get ready for work, 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 work. To me, I be work, 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 work. Make it something new. Bounce, 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 bounce. I don't need you or your brand new friends, or your bougie friends. I don't need love, you can make diamonds. You can like diamonds. If I was your boyfriend.
Fusion X බදාදා රාත්‍රියේ 11ට.
From the limit, we hit the turn.
Rise of Rock ඉරිදා රාත්‍රී 11:30ට.
झुमका पटियाले वाला ईयर विच ऐसा के तेरे नाल सजना वे मेरा दिल धड़के तेरे नाल सजना वे मेरा दिल एक दो तीन चार पाँच छः सात आठ नौ 10 11
Night Bird සතුදා රාත්‍රී 11:30ට.
And welcome back to Face the Nation. We are in conversation with former State Minister of Finance Airan Wickramaratne, Council Krishma Wanasuriya, Asoka Obesekara, the Executive Director of Transparency International, Sri Lanka, and of course with Captain Gehan Fernando, who's the oldest flying pilot in the country, and he's also the president of the Aircraft Owners and Operators Association of Sri Lanka. Right, this round we've got 2 minutes each. We'll start off, shall we, with Mr. Iran Wickramaratne. Mr. Wickramaratne, we've actually got a question, but Shehan will ask you that. But it's been pointed out that the government of Sri Lanka, when they were helping Sri Lankan Airlines, they also provided a sovereign guarantee for the purchase. And so there is some consternation that Sri Lankan Airlines didn't actually buy these aircraft from the manufacturer, Airbus, directly. Instead, they bought it through a company called AirCap. And when we look at what they paid, when it came to the leases, they paid something like between $165,000 to $265,000 over and above the market rates. And that was a month. When it came, the total price without the second set of A350-900s came to the overpayment, if you like, over and above the market rates, came to something like nearly $2.5 million. Why? Could you explain why it is that the government looked the other side when, having agreed to provide the sovereign guarantee, they went to buy it through a intermediary?
Actually, these are huge capital payments that the government of Sri Lanka can't really afford to. So ultimately, how the transaction would work is through a leasing arrangement.
Yeah.
And that's how the transactions work here also. But the difference was these were new aircrafts. Now there are different ways to look at this. What you said was right, that the leases were above the then prevailing market rates. Yeah. Then there was another way to look at it. The other way to look at it was, were these aircrafts really needed? We had other aircrafts. And then we were going to brand new aircrafts, and we were going to aircrafts which were larger, aircrafts which could actually fly much longer distances and hours and so forth and so on.
Yeah, it had a longer range.
Yes. So this whole issue about did we do a deal to purchase aircrafts and then try to justify it by finding a strategy, and then you go and get a consultant who comes and gives you a report to justify a decision that you have already made. In the case of these Airbuses, it looks more like that. It looks more like that, right? That actually happened. Because another way to look at the financials are, if you look at the aircrafts we had, and if we were buying not new but nearly new aircrafts, and if we looked at the 330s, the 350s, then the difference per month on aircraft were more like $550,000 to $1 million in terms of the lease rentals. So as I said, when it comes to financials, it depends how you look at it. Whichever way you look at it, from the inception you could say that the deal was corrupt. Because if you take the view you took and showed that the lease was above the prevailing market rates, it was corrupt. Because on the 31st of October 2016, I actually had a press conference on this. I didn't have all the evidence, but I talked precisely this language, and I said this transaction is corrupt. That's not because I know about aircrafts. That's because you have a sense of finance, and you know from a sense of finance that this is actually a corrupt transaction. If I can just say one quick thing. Please about what Krishma, the attorney, referred to about the cancellation, I would like to say this. You order aircrafts, and then subsequently a board finds out that those aircrafts don't really fit the strategy for which you are really operating. And then you say, we don't need all those aircrafts, you need to cancel some of those aircrafts. I will draw a distinction between actually having a reason to cancel the aircraft and the transaction being corrupt. I will draw a distinction there. So the question I would really ask is, did we overpay when we actually settled the transaction, more than the question, should we have cancelled it? Because ultimately we would be dependent on the management and the consultants and the reports that are coming from management.
Thank you. Can I just bring in Mr. Asoko Besekre here and ask him, we've been posed a question by a member of the public. What chances for recovery? And it goes on. It says here that even the first board had 2 family members. I think that's right, yeah. They had 2 family members. The post-2015 government had various friends and also family, as Krishmal Banasuri pointed out earlier. We had, there's a connection between the chairman appointed by the Palane government and Kapila Chandrasena, and another person who we won't name, but it's a sportsman, and they're related to each other. Given all these, what chances of recovery? And the fact that we now have the president who's, at the beginning, when they bought it, he had a nephew, and his brother's brother-in-law was also on the board. What chances for recovery?
I mean, it's tough to comment on it purely because I don't even know the nature of the agreement that was entered into. However, I mean, like, I can see, I mean, here's a letter that TI Sri Lanka and a whole host of other organizations in other countries that were facing this same situation, ranging from Tunisia to Indonesia. In June 2018, we wrote to the Serious Fraud Office in the UK, ensuring that in whatever steps that they take to ensure that compensation for the harm caused was a key component of this. Now, what we're seeing is that now, actually, interestingly, the Sri Lankan component of the fine has been paid in the UK, because now there's a US component, a French component, and a UK component.
Yeah.
The component that links to Sri Lanka has been paid, the fine has been paid in the UK. So I think it's very, very important that we really push the UK authorities to identifying the harm caused, and then for the fine that has been paid to the UK authorities to actually be, at least to some degree, sent to Sri Lanka to address the harm that has been caused. But I mean, the chances of it, things like that, I can't speculate on. The one thing that I would say is that, Mr. Vikramaratne touched on the use of mutual legal assistance, things like that. The other thing which is also sort of stuck in the pipeline as well is a draft proceeds of crime bill, and that draft proceeds of crime bill has the entire mechanics of asset recovery and how, if and when funds are recovered, how those funds have to be managed domestically. Because I think one of the concerns, and I think this is a very unpopular point to make, but one of the concerns in reality is that in other countries, when they talk about the repatriation of funds, and they are asking themselves, hang on a second, are we sending money back to the same people who may have been potentially complicit in the corrupt deal to start with? Those are questions that definitely go through the minds of those who have to think of returning funds. And so then looking at our proceeds of crime bill and the potential framework that gets set up there, how you ring fence that money to ensure it goes to particular things, not just to sort of be flung into some other folly. Those are very important points to think about going forward.
Thank you. Krishmal, you?
Yeah, just a quick one, a slightly different view to what Asoka just commented on. The question being from your view on the possibility of recovery. Faraz, I have a different take on this. Now, if you look at the report on the settlements in the UK, the fines that Asoka referred to are for the violations of the UK legislation in UK. Now, quite independent of that, a Washington court has struck a deal with Airbus France for the losses caused on the US government side.
For breaking the US laws.
Yeah. So I want you to understand very carefully. The government of the United States and Washington court, they had an out-of-court settlement under which they agreed not to prosecute Airbus for period of time. Now that is not a fine in the UK under UK legislation. That's for the losses caused to the US government. Similarly, France enters a similar outer court settlement agreement by bringing action against Airbus.
Yeah.
Now, my question is, when you look at the deal that was struck here, right, other than catching some, as Iran said, relatively small fry compared to the millions of dollars that the government has lost, some $2 million man has been taken to the magistrate's court and we are being shown that this is the be all and end all of it. Other than prosecuting him for what he may or may not have done as CEO, what about the losses caused to the government of Sri Lanka, like Washington, like France? When are we going to start instituting action against Airbus? And when are we going to rake in our money that we lost on behalf of the citizens of this country? And who is going to answer for that? I'd like to know. Has Sri Lankan Airlines or the Finance Ministry even started thinking about it now?
I have a question for you on that. Somebody's actually sent us this question. What about the liability of the directors at the time?
Yeah, so as all of us agree, more importantly, the Audit Amendment Act, what's that act called, Asoka? The National Audit Act, the amendment which brought in personal liability for those who... Other than that, after the amendment
will
of the Companies Act...
Will that cover the directors
it will cover some of it if you're found to have been negligent in office. But the actions of directors for us, after the amendment to the Companies Act also, you can go after directors personally in their personal capacities other than as functionaries of the company, Salomon and Salomon company and directors being, shareholders being different concept. But I don't think, as Asoka said, the way to go about it. This is my legal advice. Lanka doesn't have to take my advice. They can get better lawyers' advice. But I think that it would be a waste to go behind individual directors who the governments or, as you said, some friends and classmates are appointed and go after them. You will have to run to Australia and Dubai and all that to catch them. And even then you may not have enough assets to recover hundreds and fifties of billions of dollars. I don't think that's the way to go about it. Airbus has the money. And Airbus has faulted our government. The state, when I say, we must be careful. Governments are impermanent. They are temporary. They come and go. Red, green, blue, all sorts of rainbow colors. We make governments every 5 years. But the state is permanent. This loss has been caused to the state, us. The state means us, our sovereign power. Now, when our executive servants or our legislative servants or even our judicial servants going to recover this money for us? That's my interest.
Shehan, you have a question?
Yes, I do. It's for the former minister. Why wasn't an arrest made during the Yahapalana government for Kapila Chandrasena?
Yeah, as I said, I can only speculate because the moment he stepped into the country, they did get a travel ban, right? Then that was in 2019. And they probably had been here for a couple of months or a few weeks. And in that environment, maybe the CID didn't move ahead with an arrest during that kind of period of time, the short window. And therefore, they were very ready and then they probably moved after that. I can't really say more than that because I just don't know. But I think that certainly the investigations were all up to date so that the moment they come into the country, they get a travel ban and the CID is ready.
But isn't there a problem in terms of accountability here, Mr. Wickramaratne?
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't want to say that exactly because I think that these transactions are very complicated and these transactions generally take a long time to actually establish and so forth the evidence, so I won't say that that maybe if the insinuation is that somebody high up in the political area was trying to block them moving ahead or something. I wouldn't want to speculate on that. I would probably come to the conclusion that the investigations were on. It will inevitably lead to prosecution. I think that this is just the tip of the iceberg because if you look at the losses in the British court, it was $16.8 million, of which they said $2 million had been paid there. And I think the balance may have also been paid out in different ways. In addition to that, there are lots of other details in this. For example, there was, generally there are spare parts that come with this. Maybe the spare parts, I don't know, maybe Captain knows more about this, because there was a VIP kit. Maybe it was swapped. Then subsequently governments changed. Then we go and basically say no VIP kit.
Mr. Wickramaratne, does this basically mean that if not the UK investigation or the French company admit that there was a fraud taken place, does that mean that this whole issue where 10 aircraft, the purchasing of 10 aircraft was bribed, will that be simply swept under the carpet if not it was made public?
No, I of course have now come
because we saw it was right after this was made public that the fraud took place, then Kapila was taken under arrest. Does that simply, I mean, looking at in a very general perspective, it looks like if not that was made public, it would have been just swept under the carpet.
No, I don't think it would have necessarily been like that. You know, this thing about is that the public have lost confidence in our system, and also in our system in the sense of, you know, having the you know, a judicial decision where cases are quickly filed, cases are heard, judgments are given, just not on this, on lots of transactions. You know, the bond transactions we have talked about, EPF we have talked about, we are talking about Sri Lankan Airlines and so forth. So in the past, people may not have been even aware, particularly I would say, you know, on the EPF investments, capital markets. I think, you know, despite the forensic audit, my personal view is, having been in the finance area, that some of these practices have been going on for maybe 30, 40 years. And suddenly now we are looking at the last 20 years. So I think that one is awareness issue, and then now the people are more aware. So I think on all these transactions, the big ones that we are talking, people, there may be people, I won't rule it out, maybe trying to delay things, you know, and push it back. But I am very confident now that these transactions, whether it is the bond transaction, whether it is the EPF transaction, whether it's the airlines transactions, will not go under. And all those responsible, including those who are holding executive officers, including presidents and past presidents, right? I believe that society is changing, the world has changed. They will be held responsible. For a period of time, right, they may be able to get away as long as they hold office, because they have immunity while they hold office. But I think we need to take confidence from the fact that things are changing around the world and that they will be held accountable. Now Krishmal said something about the cancellation, the early termination. And I was drawing a distinction between fraud and the technical reasons for early termination, which may be justified, and something that Krishmal probably doesn't know. At that point of time, I was the deputy minister of that subject. Right? So that's why I'm open about it. I was the deputy minister of that subject. It was only in 2019 that I was made the minister of the subject, and the president said, you know, we want something done, we want this turned around. So even that transaction, while in my mind there was a reason for the termination, but whether the actual price paid was right or not, that was one. How about the other option, right? If we had a suspicion about it, we could have gone to the courts then. We could have taken Airbus on at that point in time. You could have,
sorry to interrupt you, but you could have also done something about the fact that Sri Lankan Airlines didn't tell anybody. They acted as solo, completely ultra vires, and entered into an agreement to pay this without so much as a how do you do. They didn't even tell the CCEM, let alone the line minister.
That's my question. That's now, if you look at I appreciate the fact that Iran also, or whilst he was deputy minister, may not have known all the facts, because if you just look at paragraph 9 and 10 of this cabinet memo for us, right? I'm not going to get this detail, but because this question came up, it's good for us to clarify. Now, this is an answer given by the then minister when this issue is raised in cabinet as to why you had an early termination without permission. Now, look at this wording. I'll quickly read it. SLA by the letter dated 28 December 2016, in response to the reminder sent by the Secretary MPD requesting for a response for his letter dated 20th October 2016, informed referring to only the letter of 27 December 2016, since the Minister of Finance had said by the letter of 4th October 2016, a copy of the said agreement had been previously provided to the MP and not attached to the letter, and finally not attached to the letter. So, having given all that red tape, document not attached. Next paragraph. The detailed report by SLA submitted to CCM on 24th October, within brackets 20 days after the signing of the early termination agreement on 4th October. So, the detailed report submitted to the committee has been 20 days after signing the early termination agreement. Now, my question is, what is our executive office holders? What were they doing? Were they scraping coconuts without going into this?
Yeah.
That's my question, Eran.
Yeah. So it's a fair question, and as you said, the minister is saying that, so nobody can dispute it. Where the minister is saying it, and if the minister doesn't have information, you know the system.
You have to pull them up.
No, I'm saying some junior ministers never have information. But I'm looking at process here, and I'm looking at.
Don't you think that the CCEM was a bad idea?
No, I wouldn't say it's a bad idea. You know, it's like this, Faraz. It is not necessarily, you know, all the systems. If you have crooks, whatever the systems are, they will work the system. If you have crooks in the system. So I like to have systems. I like to have policies, processes, systems, audits. I'm all for it. But I'm saying people can work it. I was just making this additional point on the losses, or the magnitude of the losses. $16.84 million is what that says. I was putting on the table another $25 million because if you have cancelled your VIP unit, we just need to make sure that either that money, we get it back from Airbus, and that just can't be written off. In addition to that, Faraz, the point you raised, it is on the lease agreements itself that the hundreds of millions of dollars are being paid over time. And of that, only that 98 and the 17 or whatever was being paid.
But, you know, if you have a look at the total overpayment, if you like, over the market rates, the minimum is around 115 million, and the top figure is about 180, 179, around that, okay? And these are, of course, estimates because the market rates and so on.
And this is even without getting an airplane seat.
That's right.
Even on the aircraft,
but I want to, if we do the math now, 98 million is what they say that they paid without cabinet approval, without ministry approval, 98 million. They then forfeited 7.5 million, which was their deposit. So now, you know, 98 and 7.5, thanks to DOS, it's 105.5, okay? That's Mr. David Dawson.
Yes.
Right, and then they paid another 19.2 million. This makes it around 126 million, which to me is suspiciously close to the 115 million. My question to you, is it a possibility that Airbus, having paid out commissions of about 115 million,
they recovered it?
This is the amount they're recovering, because they're not going to give us a free lunch.
Passing down to the consumer.
There you go.
Captain Gian Fernando, from a citizen Sri Lanka point of view, what do you think should be done?
Well, first and foremost, perhaps we should see what the extent of the whole problem is, what the real quantum is. And then the recovery, I don't know whether how much you could recover from Airbus itself.
They've just paid out 3.6 billion euro, or nearly 4 billion US dollars.
So, and then the other thing is, are we going to stay with Airbus, or are we going to look at changes? There have been a few insinuations that they might think of a change of manufacturer. I don't think that is a good idea, because it's not the product we are looking at the mechanism, isn't it? So we should, the product itself is, since I'm a rare individual who has flown both types, I could say that Boeing is now in a bit of a bad situation, because there are so many questions being asked about their product. And the Airbus, I think whatever it is is a good product. So the question is, how much are you going to demand out of them?
Captain,
are you going to squeeze them for the extra bit?
When it comes to this whole topic of purchasing aircraft, we know this whole fraud centers around an business advising agency or a company. So when it comes to purchasing aircraft, what's the key role that an advising company plays in your knowledge?
The key role, as in advice they give, is whether the product is fits the market that the company is projecting for the next few years.
So it's clear and evident that the advising company should be very much aware about the market that they are going to supply the aircraft into.
So whether, as Mr. Vikramaratne said, are we going to fit the routes according to the airplanes we buy, or we buy airplanes according to the routes that we fly? So, of course, there were good ultra long range routes that we could have done. For instance, gone from Colombo to Istanbul, perhaps Istanbul, New York, and of course the Canadians had already had a pool agreement with us, so we may not have been able to get to Canada. But we have our own Sri Lankans all over the place, from USA to Canada to Auckland and in New Zealand, so we could have, there were routes that could have been done. And it need not have been stretching the airplane to its maximum range, but within a certain long range where we would have had flexibility.
You don't need ETOPS, no?
Yeah.
Thank you, Captain. Ashoka, coming back to you, now we know this whole fraud, it's not something pertaining only to Sri Lanka. It's a global fraud which took place by Airbus. We know, if we put forward few facts, we know 50 million sponsorship of a sports team owned by 2 Air Asia executives. There was another fraud taken place with Air Asia. Then again, Indonesia's national airline, 3.3 million paid to a senior staff. And then we have the government of Ghana also in relation to this whole fraud. So it's clear and evident that this fraud did take place. Now we know when the court in UK took up this case, it approved a record 3.6 or 3.9 billion US dollar settlement to be paid by French plane air makers. Now we were discussing on how can we get this compensation or our piece of cake when it comes to this whole compensation amount paid. What is the due process?
I mean, firstly, when it comes to our entitlement, I mean, whilst I emotionally will say that we certainly need to go and make a claim for compensation, given the fact that I have not seen the agreement, I am tentative on that, but I'm confident that the fact that there is an admission that there has been bribery to secure the deal would put us in quite a strong position. I think there are two routes. I mean, I completely agree with Krishmal that we should be seeking compensation from Airbus. But I also feel that, I mean, looking at other examples in very different circumstances of money which has been sort of is sitting in another country, and looking at the process of returning that money, a lot of that is also around bilateral relations as well. So, I mean, the fact that the British government has received money from a fine far in excess of the losses that we have incurred from this deal. Yeah. And I've got a feeling we also need to think a little bit about how we calculate our losses. I mean, there are the immediate losses around cancellation payments, but there will be other losses which emanate from that which have not also been calculated as well. So I mean, the idea of trying to recoup those losses from the fine that has already been paid by Airbus in the UK will be essential. The actual mechanisms and the legal processes and how that has to happen is not something that I can actually answer in great detail here. But I mean, I think it is essential that the Sri Lankan Airlines and the government really start pushing on that front to actually start that process.
So what is the exact local authority that should step forward and initiate action with regard to this?
Well, I mean, I think it certainly should be either the Sri Lankan Airlines or the government. And I think the fact that the OECD guidelines for multinational corporations indicates that there's a national point of contact in each OECD country which needs to be engaged with is a good first step.
Mr. Wadasuriya, surely there are checks and balances in place. You yourself being someone who was once at Sri Lankan Airlines, I recall you were saying that you were in conversation with Faraz recently, you say that as far as you understand, nothing happened when you were there because you would have noticed.
Yeah.
Surely there's something in the system that would have set off an alarm bell somewhere, for someone to raise an alarm, to say something's wrong here. Why did this not happen sooner, in your opinion?
Why it didn't happen, Shahan, going from the unsafe area of speculation to a safe area of possible a factual analysis based on what I knew as an employee for 10 years. The boards that I remember, of course, there would have been on and off some nepotism around, but overall, largely, boards were not manipulated by classmates of state leaders who had absolutely zero idea of running airlines, nor family members of state leaders who have never run airlines. I remember we had 4 chief officers, CFO, CMO, CEO and CEO, chief financial, chief marketing, chief executive and chief engineering, CE. And the top management of running the airline was left in their hands. That is why there's an old saying that that we were never scared to get on a plane, even though upon landing, the voyage report comes that upon landing a piece had fallen off. These are that old, these aircraft. But the boys used to say, don't worry, our engineering fellows will at least tie a rope and give it to us, that until we land in England, it will be safe. After that, it will make for another 40 hours. That's a different story. But we'll be safe. We had that confidence. You know why? Because we had confidence that the airline was being run well. But later on, after leaving, I mean, on and off, I have appeared for the Flight Attendants Union. There are some pilots' problems that I've looked at. And I've been engaged in a litigatory sense with some airline deals, some contracts, some tenders that we challenged in court. I realized certain discussions that have gone place over the telephone when deals were struck, that shows the lack of management, and that is why I hold the executive responsible. Because I said, no, this is executive government, no. The executive must manage our asset, and that they haven't done, and that's my main grievance.
Is this under the public property?
It is public property in a larger sense, but under the Bribery Act itself, this particular scandal, although we may have a problem of attaching the place of where the crime was committed, but of course that present law provides for it. Now, for example, in our Bribery Act, I think it's around section 49 to about 50, somewhere around there, in as much as soliciting a bribe is a crime, giving a bribe is also a crime. Right? Giving a bribe is a crime in our law. Now,
very, very quickly, the Auditor General is now able to look into companies where the government owns over 50%. So in the case of Sri Lankan Airlines, the government, the Treasury, owns 99%.
But Auditor General goes for us via the legislative arm of government. No? That's because Parliament has Parliament.
Shahan's question is whether this comes under the Public Property Act.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is there is executive government, which is appointed government, Prime Minister, President, Cabinet. Legislative arm is the Parliament, all 225, and Auditor General, being the Chief Financial Officer, is responsible to government, the Parliament, because Parliament has overall control of finances. So you're talking of another angle that we can investigate. But as to where the actual crime, in my opinion, actual crime, if there was a bribe given and that had been admitted elsewhere, I think it's high time that we at least started the prosecution. We may have to face, I say, questions of jurisdiction on where the crime took place. But present law provides for internet crime, on how do you attach jurisdiction even when there is communication that can attach a paper trail. So we can look into it. But I think we need to start looking at prosecution.
Thank you. On that note, we'll go for, sorry it's taken a bit of time, but we'll go for a short break. We'll be right back.